The morning of November 9th, 1888, dawned cold and grey in London's East End. The fog was thick, wrapping the city in a shroud of mystery and foreboding. A chill hung heavy in the air, clinging to the cobbled streets and cramped alleyways of Whitechapel. The dampness seemed to seep into the very bones of the city, making every step feel like a journey through a ghostly landscape. It was a day like any other, filled with the usual sounds of hawkers and the clatter of carriage wheels. The market bustled with life, vendors shouting their wares, and the rhythmic clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages echoed through the streets. Yet this day would forever be etched in the annals of history, forever stained with the blood of Mary Jane Kelly. Her name would become synonymous with one of the most infamous murder sprees in history. At 13 Miller's Court, a squalid tenement building in the heart of Whitechapel, a tragedy was about to unfold. The building, with its crumbling facade and narrow corridors, was a stark reminder of the harsh realities of life in Victorian London. It was here, in this den of poverty and despair, that Mary Jane Kelly, a young woman trapped in a life she didn't choose, would meet her gruesome end. Her life, marked by hardship and struggle, was about to be cut tragically short. Her story, like those of the other women who fell victim to the monster known as Jack the Ripper, was one of hardship, desperation, and ultimately unimaginable violence. Each victim's tale was a testament to the brutal reality of life for many women in the East End.
I approached 13 Miller's Court with a sense of unease. The narrow alleyways seemed to close in around me, and the air was thick with an unspoken dread. I had been sent to collect overdue rent from Kelly, a task I had performed many times before. Each visit was a reminder of the grinding poverty that plagued the area, but this time felt different. But something felt different this morning. There was an eerie stillness, a silence that seemed to press down on me as I walked. A strange silence hung over the building, broken only by the distant sounds of the awakening city. The usual morning bustle seemed muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. As I knocked on the door, I noticed something peculiar. The door, usually so solid and unyielding, seemed to shudder under my touch. One of the window panes was broken, offering a glimpse into the dimly lit room beyond. The broken glass glinted ominously, hinting at the horror that lay within. What I saw next would forever haunt my dreams. The scene inside was one of utter devastation, a tableau of horror that defied comprehension. Blood, in horrifying quantities, stained the walls and bedclothes. The sheer volume of it was staggering, painting a gruesome picture of the violence that had occurred. And lying amidst this crimson nightmare was a sight that made my blood run cold. The lifeless body of Mary Jane Kelly, mutilated beyond recognition, lay in a twisted heap, a tragic end to a life of suffering.
Panic surged through Bowyer, a wave of dread washing over him as he stood frozen in place. His mind struggled to comprehend the scene before him, the grotesque reality clashing with his sense of normalcy. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum, each beat echoing the horror he had just witnessed. This was no ordinary crime, no simple act of violence that could be easily explained or understood. This was the work of a monster, a being of pure malevolence whose name had already become synonymous with terror.
Murder! Blood! Kelly! The words rang out, a cacophony of fear and disbelief.
Turning on his heel, Bowyer fled back to his employer, John McCarthy, his words tumbling over themselves incoherently as he tried to convey the horror he had seen. McCarthy, though initially skeptical, was taken aback by the sheer terror in Bowyer's eyes. Something was terribly wrong, and he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Together they returned to Miller's Court, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the area, a silence that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. McCarthy peered cautiously through the broken window, his gaze falling upon the horrific tableau within, a scene that would be forever etched into his memory. The sight confirmed their worst fears, a nightmare made real in the dim light of the room. Mary Jane Kelly was dead, her life brutally snuffed out in an act of unimaginable violence. Word of the murder spread like wildfire through the streets of Whitechapel, each whispered word stoking the flames of fear that already gripped the community, a community now held hostage by terror. The name on everyone's lips, uttered in hushed tones, was Jack the Ripper, a name that had come to symbolize the very essence of fear and evil. The East End had become a hunting ground, and its women were prey, living in constant fear of becoming the next victim. The police arrived at Miller's Court to find a scene of unimaginable brutality, a scene that would haunt even the most hardened officers. The small, sparsely furnished room was in disarray, its walls and floor stained with blood, a testament to the violence that had occurred there. On the bed lay the mutilated body of Mary Jane Kelly, her once vibrant life extinguished in a final act of savage violence, a life ended in a manner so brutal it defied comprehension. Inspector Walter Dew, a seasoned officer known for his composure, was one of the first on the scene. Nothing in his years of experience could have prepared him for the horrors that awaited him within the confines of 13 Miller's Court. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood. The silence was deafening.
As I stepped inside, my gaze was drawn immediately to the bed. The sheer brutality of the murder was evident in every detail. Kelly's body had been savagely mutilated, her flesh torn and disfigured beyond recognition. The killer had taken his time, inflicting pain and suffering with a chilling meticulousness.
Dr. Thomas Bond, the police surgeon, arrived to begin the grim task of examining the body. His trained eye took in the horrific details. The extent of the mutilation was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It was clear that the killer possessed a deep-seated rage, a thirst for blood that knew no bounds. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the Ripper's known victims, was just a girl when she was thrust into the unforgiving streets of Whitechapel. Life had dealt her a cruel hand, robbing her of her innocence and leaving her to fend for herself in a world that offered little hope or compassion.
She had come to London seeking a better life, a chance to escape the poverty and despair of her childhood. But the city, vast and indifferent, offered only hardship and exploitation. Forced into prostitution to survive, she became just another nameless face in the teeming crowds, her dreams fading with each passing day.
Despite her circumstances, those who knew Mary Jane Kelly remembered her as a kind and gentle soul. She possessed a quiet beauty, a spark of hope that flickered amidst the darkness of her existence. But her spirit, like her body, would be brutally crushed by the monster who preyed on the women of Whitechapel.
Section 5. The Shadow of Poverty. Whitechapel in the late 19th century was a place of stark contrasts. Opulence and poverty existed side by side, separated by an invisible line that few dared to cross. For those trapped in the squalor of the East End, life was a constant struggle for survival. The streets were a labyrinth of dimly lit alleyways and overcrowded tenements where disease and despair festered. Poverty was a suffocating presence, casting a long shadow over the lives of its inhabitants. It was in this environment, where hope was a luxury few could afford, that Jack the Ripper found his victims. Women like Mary Jane Kelly, forced into prostitution to survive, were the most vulnerable. They lived on the fringes of society, their lives deemed expendable by those who held the reins of power. Their deaths, though tragic, were often met with indifference, their stories quickly forgotten amidst the clamour of the city. The night of November 8th, 1888, was like many others in Whitechapel. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very streets themselves whispered secrets to those who dared to listen. A cold wind howled through the streets, carrying with it the stench of poverty and the murmur of distant voices. The fog rolled in, cloaking the alleys in a shroud of mystery, making every shadow seem alive. It was a night for secrets, for hidden desires and dark deeds. The kind of night where the line between reality and nightmare blurred, and the whispers of the past seemed to echo through the present. Mary Jane Kelly, seeking solace from the cold, had retreated to the relative warmth of her small room at 13 Miller's Court. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls, as if the room itself was alive with unseen presences. She had a visitor that night, a man whose identity remains a mystery to this day. Their meeting was shrouded in secrecy, their intentions known only to themselves. Their conversation, if there was one, was lost to the night. The walls of her room, if they could speak, would tell tales of whispered words and unspoken fears. Sometime after midnight, the sound of screams pierced the darkness. It was a chilling cry, one that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. But in the cacophony of the East End, such cries were often ignored. The streets were filled with the sounds of suffering. And one more scream was just another note in the symphony of despair. Life and death were cheap in Whitechapel. The residents had grown accustomed to the ever-present threat of violence, and the cries of the night were a grim reminder of their harsh reality. Few paid attention to the plight of the less fortunate. The struggle for survival left little room for compassion, and the cries of the desperate often fell on deaf ears.
It was a night like any other, filled with whispers and shadows. The fog seemed to carry the voices of the past, mingling with the present in a haunting chorus. We all heard the screams, but, well, such things were not uncommon in those days. The night was alive with the sounds of suffering, and we had learned to turn a blind eye.
The cries faded into the night, leaving behind only questions and a chilling silence. The fog swallowed the sounds, and the streets returned to their eerie stillness as if nothing had happened at all. News of Mary Jane Kelly's murder sent shockwaves through the community. The East End, already on edge after a series of brutal killings, was gripped by fear. The Ripper, it seemed, had claimed his final victim. The police investigation, already under intense scrutiny, intensified. Officers scoured the streets, desperate for any clue that might lead them to the killer. But Jack the Ripper, as he had done so many times before, seemed to vanish into thin air.
The pressure was immense. We combed every alley, questioned every witness, but the Ripper was always one step ahead. It was as if he was a ghost.
The Whitechapel murders had exposed the dark underbelly of Victorian society. Behind the facade of respectability and progress lurked a world of poverty, violence and despair. And in the shadows, a monster stalked the streets, his reign of terror etched in the collective memory of the East End. Who was Jack the Ripper? The question has haunted historians and armchair detectives for over a century. Theories abound, each more outlandish than the last, but the killer's true identity remains shrouded in mystery. Was he a doctor, driven mad by his own twisted desires, or a butcher, skilled in the art of dismemberment? The speculation continues, fueled by the lack of concrete evidence and the passage of time. The case, though officially closed, continues to fascinate and horrify. Jack the Ripper became a symbol of the dark side of human nature, a reminder that even in the midst of civilization, evil can lurk in the shadows. Jack the Ripper became a symbol of the dark side of human nature, a reminder that even in the midst of civilization, evil can lurk in the shadows. He was a phantom, a boogeyman, who preyed on the fears of a community and then vanished without a trace.